Okay, now it's time to turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. I pursue a distinctive syllabus in that I go straight from Kant to Mill to Nietzsche. Many professors do that, but then I go back to the philosopher Hegel, Hegel. Very few philosophers do that, though persons who study Hegel carefully would understand what I'm doing, and you'll get it once we get to him. Today we're going to focus on our friend Nietzsche, and we'll try to understand how he fits into the big picture we've been looking at, and the alternative he offers, and we'll try to think through his position all the way to the end, okay, and evaluate it as best we can to see if it's a live alternative to those we have looked at so far. Now, to set up this discussion, we actually have to go back prior to Mill, whom I treat as a kind of blind alley in the history of ethics, as you gathered from my criticisms last time. Back to Immanuel Kant, who is a live option, and many of you have been defending Kant in your journals and in the discussion board. And I have to say, I'm quite stimulated by your remarks and pleased. This group has defended Kant more energetically than any other ethics section that I've had. I had a couple of energetic defenders of Kant at CCRI, a live face-to-face class back in 2021. And other than that particular class, you folks are the most energetic defenders of Kant I've encountered. You just like the idea, apparently, that you should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Don't worry about the consequences, right? Or do your duty because it's your duty from the consciousness that it is your duty. Okay. So let's dive right in. Immanuel Kant denied that one can prove the truth of any metaphysical system, but specifically theistic supernaturalism, by arguments that rely upon a priori theoretical premises. Now, what's a priori? A priori means you can know it without having to adduce evidence. So you know that everything is identical to itself. You don't have to find any evidence to know that that's true. You know that 1 billion plus 1 billion is 2 billion. You don't actually have to count out 2 billion items to get to that truth. Okay. So a priori theoretical premises include that to be is to be a substance with attributes. That, what does that mean? And for example, to be a cup of coffee with a certain weight and a certain color on the surface of it with a certain chemical composition and so on. Or that all events and all states of affairs have a cause, right? Nothing just pops into being, it has to be brought into being, so long as we're talking about something in time. Another a priori theoretical premise would be that all possibilities are actualized in an infinite time. Kant might say, well, how do you know that, right? They are premises, right? These a priori premises that supposedly, the whole history of metaphysics tells us, may be known by immediate intellection, by an immediate intuition of thought, right? Without any appeal to evidence. So Kant, that we spent the first part of his professional life up to the age of 40 or so trying to do that kind of metaphysics, he then changed his mind about that in a very famous way, really history-changing way. So Kant argued that we are nonetheless bound by deductive inference to conclude that we are free, right? Because we're conscious of the moral law, and what you ought to do implies what you can do, that you have the power to do it. We should also recognize that we are bound to infer that the soul is immortal, he says. You know, you might be surprised by some of this, but this is all based on his moral premises, not on a priori theoretical premises. And then he argues that we have to acknowledge God exists. And some of you are surprised by that too, because you said, oh, I thought he rejects theistic supernaturalism. Well, what he rejects is the classical methodology of theistic supernaturalism, okay? And he ends up, once you follow him all the way to the end of his system, is with a new way of justifying theistic supernaturalism, okay, on the basis of moral self-consciousness. All right, so let's see how that goes. So of course, the basic premise for Kant is the consciousness that one ought to do one's moral duty for duty's sake. We've said that so many times It's baked into your consciousness by now, and given how you people have been talking about this material, I think you'll have a hard time forgetting it. So Kant adds the premise. Let's see his reasoning now for, we have the argument for freedom. That was pretty evident. But let's see his reasoning for the immortality of the soul in God. So Kant adds the premise that moral self-consciousness appoints moral ends to the first place, not merely relative to the agent, the word merely should be in there, but also relative to the totality of existence, right? You recall the first sentence in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Okay, and now you're seeing why this is a metaphysics of morals, right? Okay. The first sentence says at the end of existence, well, I don't have the sentence right here, but effectively the end of the existence itself is the goodwill. All right. That's by the way, that's a kind of bald and bold humanism that would have struck someone like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or any of these scholastic philosophers or any major Jewish philosopher like Gersonides or Maimonides or any major Muslim philosopher like Avicenna or Averroes. It would have struck any of those fellows as a kind of blasphemy or kind of blasphemy and outright apostasy, right? It's just departing from the acknowledgement that the one true God is the end and all of existence. Kant says, no, it's the goodwill. Okay. So from this, the agent must infer that the totality of existence is organized for the sake of a goodwill. All right. So my italicized organized. Okay. So now he adds a third premise. For the good, you know what a premise is? That's a premise in an argument, right? That's one of the statements you take into account in order to get to the conclusion you're trying to show is true. Okay. So here's his third premise. For the goodwill to be made the end of all existence, its being such an end must be signified, and I put that in italics too, by its being awarded with an extra moral good. To be rewarded with an extra moral good, namely happiness. You get that? So it's not good enough for you simply to do your duty. All of existence has to be oriented around you and other rational agents doing their duty, and it has to be organized around that in a specific way that when you do your duty, sooner or later, well, let's put it this way, if you do your duty consistently over a lifetime, you will receive your due reward later, okay? That is not encountered in Aristotelian-Thomism, where you're doing your duty is itself an intrinsic reward, and it has a kind of natural if I can put it this way, a natural supernatural consequence, which involves your being elected into heaven. It's a bit more complicated than that because there's no amount of good deeds you could do for Aquinas that could merit your enjoying the eternal company of an infinite good, because the best you can do is a whole series of finite goods, so that's not going to get you into heaven. But you can receive the blessing of a being who's capable of an infinite good. And through baptism and affirmation of the creed, you do that, you receive that blessing, and then you affirm your allegiance to that being, Jesus Christ, right, who helped you. You affirm your allegiance by obeying him, and then you grow in merit, and then you go to heaven. It's a more complicated scheme. For Kant, it's much simpler, all right? For Kant, it's much simpler. You simply do a whole series of good deeds. Maybe you mess up once or twice, but on balance, you do a whole series of good deeds from your consciousness of duty, and you die having a good moral record, and then you deserve a reward. It's a very kind of straightforward, almost accountant's way of thinking about morality and rewards. So, of course, likewise, the morally wicked should be punished with unhappiness. Now, does Kant say eternal unhappiness and eternal happiness? He seems to say that, actually. And you have to wonder, well, why would you deserve eternal happiness if all you've done is a finite number of good deeds. I mean, maybe you deserve an all expenses paid vacation in the Caribbean, island hopping for 100 years. And then after that, you're paid. You've been paid off, you're done. On the basis of Kant's reasoning and his system, it doesn't seem that anyone can actually deserve basically unlimited beatitude. And Aquinas agrees. Aquinas would say no one deserves unlimited beatitude. It's a gift. Just accept the gift. It's being given to you for free. Just take it. But Kant seems to want to maintain that we can deserve that, and that's really hard to justify. So that would be a problem Kant would confront. Now you could be a modified Kantian and say, well, basically, if you're a good person and you die, what you merit is maybe 100 years of an all expenses paid vacation, or the equivalent of this, your favorite part of the globe, and that's what you get, and then your soul blinks out of existence, right? I mean, you can come up with some kind of alternative scheme. It might look a little eccentric, but one is free to construct a system one wants to construct in accordance with the logical arguments one puts together, and then you have to evaluate it, and that's that. So letter C here, the conjunction of goodness and happiness, not conjunctions. Seem to have a problem with basic typing today. The conjunction of goodness and happiness and wickedness and unhappiness do not obtain with sufficient regularity in this world, or so Kant maintains. Hence, there must be an afterlife in which these conjunctions are brought about, right? So I might put that in italics for him. See, that's where he gets this afterlife. This requires an immortal soul and a God who brings about these conjunctions, right? Of goodness and happiness. Now, happiness for him is basically having all of your desires satisfied, all of your good desires satisfied. And unhappiness is having your desires, whether good or bad, not satisfied, okay? So, of course, this God, as a matter of course, has to be omniscient, right? He has to see everything that you've done and that everyone has done, down to the minutest detail, in order to determine the rewards and punishments of justice. He has to be effectively omnipotent, right? He can exercise this power over souls that have departed from their bodies. And he's also omnibenevolent because he is concerned consistently and without any kind of a rupture in his concern or break in his concern, that good people get rewarded and bad people get punished. Basically, he's concerned with a goodwill being made the end of existence. And this is a rather peculiar looking God who basically subordinates himself and makes himself simply a servant of the human goodwill. Again, compare that to Aristotelian Thomism, basically medieval Christianity. And there, God is indeed, he does make himself the servant of human beings, but at the same time, he is the end of creation. He's both at once. And he's primarily the end of creation, right? But he's also the servant. That's why he's willing to suffer a violent and humiliating death for the sake of benefiting, saving is the theological term, his creatures. Okay. So this new Kantian conception of God, right? Well, this is the classical conception of God. He's omniscient. He's omnibenevolent, right? And he's omnipotent. He knows all that stuff. He has all those attributes. But now revelation has been shorn away, right? I mean, where do you find revelation? Well, in the book of Genesis and in Exodus and so on, in the Old Testament or the Tanakh if you're Jewish, and in the New Testament, and in what they call in the Muslim tradition the Noble Quran if you're Muslim. Okay. If you are a Mormon, I run into Mormons here or there, or they have a kind of sister church called they used to call themselves the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Then you recognize the Book of Mormon, and they have Doctrine and Covenants. They have their own. Okay, you see what I'm saying? So all that revelatory material gets kind of shot out into space with Kant. All you have left are his deductions. And then the rather peculiar conclusion that there's basically an infinitely powerful being who's made himself the unqualified servant of human beings with a goodwill. And that's it. So Kant calls the fact that one arrives at these conclusions, right? Because how do we get to these conclusions? We got them from a moral premise. or moral premises, a series of them here. Okay? The fact that we have to begin with moral premises and then prove that the soul is immortal and God exists, not to mention that we're free, he calls that the primacy of practical reason rather than theoretical reason. We have to think in a practical mode, okay, in order to get those conclusions. And the conclusions just happen to line up with those of the entire Western tradition, but then with this major subtraction. And there are two major subtractions. Number one, that God is no longer the end of existence, which is a bit of a strain. If you're talking about an infinite being who's infinitely good, wouldn't an infinitely good, or at least perfectly good, if you like? If he's perfectly good, he's infinitely good. If you're perfectly good, you're not qualified by anything outside of yourself, and you're simply good without any limit. He's infinitely good. Does it make any sense for an infinitely good being to be subordinate to and exist for the sake of and be an instrument of a finite good? Okay. One might even suggest that's really like a round square. That doesn't look too good. The second thing that concept tracks is all of sacred literature, all of revelation in the Bible and in the Quran, with which he wouldn't have been very conversant with. He wouldn't have been terribly interested in it because there were no Muslims on the European continent at that time. Well, yeah, I shouldn't say that. They were further down by Bulgaria and places like that, but out of reach for him. Yeah, that's basically that. As far as the Jewish tradition is really interesting in that. At a footnote here, this will be part of your education. I mean, the Jewish tradition at the time Kant was writing, that was basically they were just beginning to liberalize, okay? But up to that time, there was basically Orthodox Judaism, what we today call Orthodox Judaism, okay? And historically, that has been called rabbinical Judaism. And people popularly think that consists of basically what Christians call the Old Testament. And Orthodox Jewish rabbis and Orthodox Jews have kind of encouraged that, for a long time, they encouraged that image. Actually, rabbinical Judaism, historically, its whole history, promoted and affirmed the authority of what they call the Talmud. The Talmud is the Mishnah Torah, which is supposedly a set of further revelations, which don't actually match up terribly well with what you find in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and beyond. Anyway, so there's this Mishnah, and there's rabbinical commentary on the Mishnah. All that together is the Talmud. And the one that really counts is the Bavli. That's the Babylonian Talmud. There's a Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, and no one really pays any attention to that. Yeah, and then if you keep going deeper into Jewish history, you get into the thousands and the 1100s, and then there emerges something from the pen of a gentleman. We finally figured out who wrote it, a guy named Moses de Leon, a rabbi, called the Zohar, and that is basically a kind of mystical and even at times magical reading of the Torah. All right, they call that Kabbalah, which just means tradition. That's what the word means. And yeah, so that's sort of a mystical and allegorical and at times magical reading of received Jewish revelations. Okay, all right. So much for that. So pardon me for that little digression for you, but that'll come back and pay dividends towards the end of the lecture, because I'm trying to show you how the history of Western ethics, the history of Western religion relate to one another, because more than half of you, it seems, practice one religion or another. So it's fruitful for you to think about this relationship. And even if you don't, what I found is that persons who say, well, I'm not Christian, Muslim, or anything, I find that a good number of these persons put science in a position that sort of kind of resembles religion for other people. They put their trust in it. They trust scientists. They trust scientific methods. They trust what's published in scientific journals. They believe if it enters into a scientific textbook, they feel confident that it's basically true, so on and so forth. And so I would suggest there's a good number of people out there, I don't know about in this class, but there's a good number of people out there who basically belong to the Church of Scientism. Okay, and that's not a criticism. That's just an attempt at identifying and classifying a certain phenomenon. So I suggest that human beings are basically religious animals, homo religiosus, and you can't get out of it. It's a plantation you can't escape from. Okay, it's just we are homo religiosus. We want there to be some supreme being or set of beings. It could be the Homeric gods. It could be the Indian pantheon or the Egyptian. It could be the one true God of ancient Israel. It could be Jesus Christ, Yeshua. It can be Allah. It can be a bunch of scientists. Okay, Einstein, Heisenberg, and add whoever else you admire. And we seem to want and need that as a species. Okay, so let's see here. Just give me a second. So let's move on. We've already seen that Kant's skepticism about theoretical reason, about reasoning a priori from theoretical principles. In our 2 lectures ago, we saw that can be challenged, okay? I don't think his refutation of proofs for the existence of God works. I think his arguments are completely arbitrary, actually, but you know, you're welcome to and encouraged to try to shore up his arguments a bit and see if you can make it work. This is philosophy, guys. This is not David Shichyar, Dr. Shichyar, laying out his doctrine and saying, now you have to memorize what I've said and you have to agree with me. That's not how it works. Well, maybe it works that way in some philosophy seminars, but that's not how I teach my introductory courses, and even an upper level course, I wouldn't do it that way. Okay. A second difficulty is that Kant's supreme good, it turns out, is not simply having a good will. His supreme good is actually the conjunction, the joining of having a good will and being happy. So it turns out that in the final analysis, Kant has to bring in, look at this, eudaimonism through the back door. There it is, it's back. This setting up of happiness as a supreme end. Okay, at least happiness plus having a good will. So it turns out both being motivated by your consciousness of duty and you're being happy, those two things at once is your supreme end. Okay, so you have to read through hundreds of pages of Kant to get there. 4, for this and other reasons, Friedrich Nietzsche rejects Kant's philosophy while holding, okay, so now we're on to Nietzsche, while holding on to his own neo-Stoic philosophy of the primacy of the will. Remember, for the Stoic, you can exercise a kind of perfect self-control. Seemingly for Nietzsche, there's a kind of neo-Stoic element in there. It's complicated because ultimately he will deny the existence of free will, and he'll argue, it seems, that through your actions and choices, or what appears to be your actions and choices, nature is willing through you, right? You guys follow? There's something deeper going on in you, a play of forces, and those organize themselves and express themselves through your will, but that doesn't mean your will is free. That just means your will is a kind of aperture through which the forces of nature flow in order to manifest in the form of something determinate, that life that you're living right now. Okay. So Nietzsche also follows Kant in rejecting all theoretical proofs for the existence of God. Though, again, speaking in my own voice, you're not obligated to agree. One is hard pressed to discover Nietzsche's reasons for rejecting these proofs. Maybe I can say that that's textual fact. I've read a lot of Nietzsche. I can't find him actually criticizing any of these proofs anywhere. He just kind of dismisses them with a flick of the wrist. All right. So in any event, Nietzsche takes up the position of atheistic naturalism, which we have associated with Plato's character Thrasymachus way back at the beginning of the course, and with Thomas Hobbes, even though he's officially a theist. I think he's lying. With Thomas Hobbes, at least read esoterically as I read him. Again, you're not obligated to do that either, but I'm your professor, so I'm just going to tell you what I think is true. Nietzsche distinguishes himself in the history of philosophy by thinking through atheistic naturalism all the way to its bitter end. So that's why Nietzsche is particularly valuable. He takes this position of atheistic naturalism, by the way, which tends to be the basic metaphysics of those with the ethics and religion of scientism. Nietzsche thinks it all the way through to the end. So now we can follow his reasoning. If atheistic naturalism is true, premise number 1, then there is no eternity, and all is temporal. Well, that's true, because there is nothing outside of our universe. Our universe is temporal throughout, and so everything is temporal. Okay, fine. But now look at this. If all is temporal, then there are no fixed ideas or laws, because change is ruler. Change governs all. You follow? There's nothing that's fixed in principle, or a law of nature in principle, that can't change. Why? How could it? If it did, there'd be some other mode of existence that's not temporal. You follow me? And atheistic naturalism would be false. Okay, now keep going. If there are no laws in general, then there are no laws of nature. Excellent. And if there are no laws of nature, then the cosmos has no intrinsic structure. But Nietzsche affirms atheistic naturalism is true. I'm not certain on what premise he draws that conclusion. He just kind of puts it out there. And then he draws the conclusion the cosmos has no intrinsic structure. Wonderful. So he puts this, as is his wont, poetically. The center of being is chaos. All right. So, by the way, I mean, this argument here, I think it's basically solid, and it's why he says this. The center of being is chaos. There are certain philosophers out there who they see where I'm going with this. They might get slightly irritated, but that's because they've been seduced by Nietzsche. We put it perfectly frankly. They've been hypnotized by Nietzsche, who's an outstanding writer. It's easy to get swept away by him. All right, so, and we read him for a reason, because he does articulate one of the fundamental alternatives, and he thinks it through all the way to the bitter end. All right, so now let's consider this thesis. The center of being is chaos. Let's all admit to one another, okay? Let's pretend we're all in the same room here. Let's just admit to one another there is apparently a great deal of visible order in our cosmos. So the stars are arranged in a certain pattern. They seem to come back in the same pattern every night. Now, if we're in Cranston or Warwick or Providence, we can't see that very well. So drive out to, as best you can, to western Rhode Island. We're always talking about South County, but I find that the further west you go, the more country you get, right? As it were, out in Chepachet, where it's nothing but pickup trucks and gun racks and pro-Trump stickers out there. It's like Alabama. And maybe you'll see a few more stars up in the sky. So not only that, when two giraffes produce a third entity, it's never an octopus or it's never a mountain lion or anything of that sort. It's always a giraffe, right? So, and that's true of all species. Isn't that amazing, right? Aristotle said, man begets man. You could say giraffe begets giraffe. My old advisor, Stanley Rosen, used to talk about giraffes a lot. Giraffe begets giraffe, or I like koala bears. Koala bear begets koala bear, okay? Well, why does that happen? Well, apparently there's some order. And where did this order come from? Since it does not derive from atemporal ideas or laws for Nietzsche, it has to arise somehow within the cosmos itself. Okay, let's see if we can make sense of that. So, it is a fact of observation that the cosmos presents us also with myriad processes that relate to one another in patterns of action and reaction. So sometimes you find scientists trying to explain, like the emergence of life. The famous one whom I met was Stuart Kauffman. You can look him up on YouTube if you like. He has all sorts of talks. Kauffman. There may be a second N in there. Stuart. Stuart. I wonder if he's still alive. He'd be old by now. Anyway, from this fact of there being myriad processes, we can deduce two principles, okay? So first, that which acts in nature, right, tends by nature to expand its sphere of activity unless checked by an equal or greater center of expansive activity, right? So things tend to kind of sweep out a path. Just think about an asteroid moving through space. It tends to sweep out a path, and if anything gets in its way, that asteroid does what it can, so to speak, to knock that darn thing out of the way and keep going, right? That is the rather primitive and basic expression of power, concentrated in the form of an asteroid. And then as things gather around a gravitational center, they tend to pull other things towards themselves, right? They bring things into their orbit and even absorb them into their own mass, and then we get planets. right? And stars and things of that sort. So things tend to draw things into themselves and expand. So nature is organized as a kind of system of expansion and domination. Is built that way. So the second thing we can observe is that when one center of expansive activity is affected by another, it exerts itself to resist the effort of the latter to dominate it. So we have two opposed tendencies in nature. We can just see this, even deduce it. One is an expansive activity. The second is a resistant or repulsive activity. Okay, because if you're trying to expand, if something's trying to expand into the area you have dominated already, you'll try to repel it. So the repulsive activity, that is a consequence of the expansive activity. So expansion is basic and repulsion is derivative. So from the center of being as chaos, Nietzsche derives this thesis, that being is will to power. Okay? Excellent. So that seems to make some sense on the basis of what he said so far. So to be, that means to exist, to be at all, is to be a center of activity that expands until checked by another center of activity. So Nietzsche will criticize Hobbes and other atheistic naturalists for having been inconsequent in their thinking. In a certain respect, he'd have to admire Hobbes because Hobbes is this hard-headed thinker, and Nietzsche likes hard-headed. Nietzsche thought of himself as a hard-headed thinker, so whenever he gets an opportunity to praise another hard-headed thinker, he does so. But being is not a process of mere self-preservation, as in Hobbes, but of expansion and domination. Further, for beings that are sentient, right, sense powers and feelings, and in our case, thought, the most powerful among them always sacrifices comfort and pleasure for the sake of expansion and domination. Think about that. Caesar. Now, did Julius Caesar lead a comfortable life out there in the field continuously all that time? I mean, I wasn't there, and I have worked hard in my day, and I have to say that the harder I worked, the better I felt. But I'm going to imagine that persons who devoted their lives to conquest and danger, they could lead more comfortable lives, okay? And particularly if they're wealthy, he could have lived out his life on his estate with his concubines or something of that sort, right? Instead, he chose danger. Napoleon Bonaparte, any of these great captains and kings, pious Louis IX, we'll get to him later. Not exactly a great conqueror, but persons who choose live in accordance with will to power. They're not aiming at pleasure, guys. You can provide yourself Alexander the Great. Okay, you can provide yourself Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun. You can provide yourself hundreds of examples, if not thousands. You get deeper into history, you get thousands of examples. So one difficulty with this theory is that by rejecting all fixed structures and laws, Nietzsche also rejects the principle of contradiction. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road with Herr Professor Nietzsche. Okay, he was a professor of philology at the University of Basel, and a philological genius. He had a genius for language and many other things. So what's the principle of contradiction? Well, let's say it this way. He rejects the principle according to which a fact cannot coexist with its negation, right? So if something is a bear, it's not the case that it is not a bear at all, right? Okay? I mean, you could describe it as something of a certain mass, and insofar as it's something of a certain mass, you're thinking of it as something of a certain mass and not as a bear. But the absolute negation would be to say it's not a bear at all, okay? But if it's a bear, it's a bear. Okay, so this is sort of basic to common sense. So if he rejects this principle that something can both be a bear and not be a bear at all, right? He's in hot water. Now you have to take this rejection of the principle of contradiction, and you have to apply it to his own thesis that being is will to power, right? So this means that being is will to power is compatible with being is not will to power. Terrific. And that is strictly unthinkable. Now you can, for obvious reasons, and now you can try to get around this and say, well, okay, maybe being is will to power, and the first act of will to power is to will a consistent cosmos, or at least an approximation thereunto. Okay, that's fine. You can try that. but that means that prior to its willing a consistent cosmos, it is will to power, and insofar as it exists prior to the act of willing, it is not will to power, because the principle of contradiction does not obtain. You can say, no, 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 will to power is the act of willing, right? Now, we're not talking about a faculty of the soul now. We're talking about a natural process of expansion. Will to power is the activity of willing its own expansion consistently. Okay. Well, now, if you're saying that, and you're saying it can't will its own contraction and disappearance, then it seems you're smuggling back in the principle of contradiction. Will to power only works in one direction, and it can't not. Pardon me, it can't work in the opposite direction, and it can't not work in the expansive direction. If that's what you're maintaining, then you're basically saying that will to power and non-contradiction are coordinate at the root of things. And if that's the case, you're saying that there's a law or a structure, probably better word, a structure built into nature, which is invariant and not subject to the corruptive influence of time. And if you're saying that, then naturalism, it seems to be false. You seem to be affirming at least an atheistic supernaturalism. Why do I say that? Because you're saying there's something it's outside of the corruptive influence of nature. Okay, it's supernatural in a certain technical sense, and it's not God. It's the principle of contradiction. You guys follow me? So you're really an atheistic supernaturalist. Okay, very good. You can be that, but that's not what. That's definitely not what Nietzsche affirmed. He definitely does not want that, without any doubt. Okay, you go on and read more of his work. If I could recommend, let's see, one work where it's so clear you couldn't miss it, that would be The Twilight of the Idols. It's very short, like 100 pages. So you read that, you'll see what I'm saying. So now Nietzsche was aware of this objection, and he wrestled with it in his private notebooks, but he never published a resolution. So this remains a serious difficulty with his philosophy. All right. So he makes some comments on some English psychologists, dripping with contempt and practically chuckling with disdain as he discusses them. And he knew Paul Ray, but these English psychologists, particularly Ray, sought an explanation for the origin of morality. Okay, so now we're into a new sort of question in this course. We've been trying to figure out, how do you lead a good life? Okay, what are the ingredients that enter into a good life? And we've looked at virtuous activity of reasoning well and expressing one's virtuous reasoning and conduct, service to the common good. If you take Aristotelian Thomism and then push it into the theological mode, it becomes glorifying God. With Hobbes, it becomes living by the golden rule so as to preserve your comfortable self-preservation. With Kant, it becomes acting from duty for the sake of duty. We'll mention Mill. For Mill, it becomes promoting the happiness for the greatest number, okay, and so on. But now we're to a new question. Our question is that of the origin of morality, okay? And by the way, the idea of the good life is not the same thing as the idea of a right action. Okay, so then you have to distinguish those two and relate them to one another. And I didn't do that in that list I just gave you. And I'm not going to go through that list again right now. So we'll just move on. This they discover in the combination of beneficial acts, that is the English utilitarians, or English psychologists, excuse me. So this they discover, the origin of morality, they discover it in the combination of beneficial acts, what they call utility, forgetting that these acts have utility, and then forming a habit of calling them intrinsically good and becoming hardened in this error. Forget about the word energetic. We got that. Well, if you want, that's from Aristotle, right? So he criticizes this theory on the ground that the utility of beneficial actions is absolutely obvious, and that this obviousness is reinforced every day, right? So if someone loans you $10, obviously that's useful to you. Or if your employer pays you, that's obviously useful to you. We can say, well, he's being just, and that justice is intrinsically good, right? But it's also beneficial. And how can you not notice that it's beneficial to you that your employer paid you? Okay. So Ray adds the remark. I'm sorry. Nietzsche adds the remark, which is more of an observation than a criticism, that this theory is the expression, he says, of dying life, of life grown weary, of a fading, decaying, and waning will to power. That may be, but he just asserts that as an observation. So in general, any shrinking back from the truth for the sake of what is psychologically reassuring and, let's say, respectable is a sign of a sick and decaying will to power. All right. So now Nietzsche was a philologist. That means he was a master of ancient languages, particularly Greek and Latin. He studied other ancient and medieval languages, okay, archaic languages. And he studied them with a kind of a scientific method. So he was a scientist, guys. You might say, what kind of scientist is this? A scientist study nature. Well, you have to look at things from the continental perspective. He spoke German as his native language. So if you speak German as your native language, you actually distinguish between two large departments of science. The Naturwissenschaften, these are the sciences of nature, and the Geisteswissenschaften. Those are the sciences of the human spirit. Geistes means spirit. So that would refer to, if you're an art historian from that point of view, you're a scientist. If you are a student of ancient languages or any language, you're a scientist from that point of view. A serious student of literature, you're a scientist from that point of view. You guys follow me? So keep that in mind. He was a philologist. So it should come as no surprise he takes language as his key to discovering the true origin of morality. Another sort of biographical note about Nietzsche. So he was a huge fan of the opera. Okay, and he found that a huge fan of music, and he found that music activated something in him which revealed what is really true about a human being. Okay, the passions are more fundamental than what we call reason, and the passions in some way govern. He found that the passions are somehow a kind of expression of the basic will to power, which governs all things, right? So if you combine his being a student of languages, a scientific student of languages, and his love of music and his adherence to the thesis that the passions are what really count as expressions of will to power, then you get a kind of picture of the way his mind worked, all right? Sometimes those little brief biological sketches can say one or two things. Like if he heard me right now, he'd probably be irritated at me or accuse me of being sick and dying life or something of that sort. But I can take it, and I think what I've said is true. And if I develop those ideas more thoroughly, maybe over an article or a book length treatment, I could make that quite illuminating, I'm certain. Anyway, so he takes language as his key. So let's consider two of his examples. First, he takes the German word schlecht, which means bad. Now, originally, that referred to a commoner. That's you and me, guys. You know, right? We're not royals, not blue bloods, right? That used to refer to a commoner as opposed to an aristocrat. Terrific. Now, second, he considers the Greek term, he jumps languages here, esthelos. He translates this as the one who is. Almost sounds like God, right? The true. And in the Catholic Church, they do call God truth. Ave Verum. Hail truth, right? So let's see here. Put that. I just can't stand it when things are out of line. But this was the word, or a word at least, the Greek nobility used to refer to themselves, the esthelos. So now we're getting a key into the history of morality. It has something to do with different classes of persons. So the origin of moral discourse has to do with how human beings have described different groupings within a society, the aristocrats versus the peasants, if you like. Okay. All right. So he knows, and these are sound observations. I don't think anybody really disputes what he's saying here. And again, these red lines drive me crazy. There we go. So he notes that moral linguistic history actually delivers two basic distinctions. Okay. He sees this in language after language. And the two basic distinctions today often get run together, but these are two distinct oppositions, all right? So first, there's the difference between good and bad. We just talked about that, all right? So the good are the aristocrats, the bad are the peasants. B is good versus evil. And then he'll point out that here, the people who draw this distinction look at things from a different point of view. Some of you say that that perception. Some of you say perception is everything. I'll get to that later and think that's false. But certainly perception, or how we perceive things, right, is extremely important for understanding our experience. No doubt about that. So if you're a commoner looking up at the aristocracy and you kind of resent how they treat you, right, because the person who owns the company you work for, he wants to charge you $800 a month just to have basic medical insurance or something of that sort. Well, you describe yourself as good, right? And then via negation, you describe him as evil. Okay, you guys follow me? So there's good versus bad, and then good versus evil. I'm thinking of an employer I used to have. He's in jail now, by the way. He charged too much for the insurance. Okay, so here we go. So on the basis of these linguistic, considerations and his background physics of will to power, which he doesn't mention for you in Genealogy of Morals, I brought that out so you see what's going on. Nietzsche arrives at the following explanation of the origin of morality. So the distinction between good and bad owes its origin to those humans who exhibit a healthy will to power, right? Those who experience goodness spontaneously as their own outpouring of life. Sort of basically healthy specimens who just are active and they think of a goal and they just go out there and start pursuing it. He calls these the active type. They define good first and bad by way of negation. Okay, so you can think of people from your background, your circle, your neighborhood, just the active persons who just think about, maybe a business model and they draw it up and they just go out and do it. And if they meet obstacles, they work through the obstacle to overcome them, or they draw up a plan. So, okay, I just have to work for a year, look at my mom, put some money in the bank, and then I'll do it. And they do it. Okay, and then before you know it, there's someone who owns 5 tractors, and he has a trucking business or something of that sort. Okay. B, there's the distinction between good and evil. The distinction between good and evil owes its origins to those human beings whose will to power is relatively weak, so whose immediate experience is in fact a reaction to the activity of the noble and strong. All right, so their experience, because they're weak, they don't experience a spontaneous outflowing of life as goodness, right? Because they're weak. What they experience first is a reaction to the activity of the noble people, the people who are active, impetuous, if you like, full of life, if you will, free in some sense. So, but the second group of persons, if you like, the natural peasants, these persons are in effect on the receiving end of the violence of the active type. So their first experience is that of suffering, which they call evil. By negation, they arrive at a peculiar concept of the good. The good now, for these folks, the persons who are naturally weak and reactive, is the negation of the attributes of the active type. So now we end up with this. For them, pride is evil and humility is good. Okay? Impetuosity, that's evil, and hesitancy actually is now good. I'm not exactly certain where Nietzsche gets this idea that being hesitant is good. I've never seen that praised, but anyway, that's what he says. Self-assertion is evil, and passivity is good. Maybe he means, what does he mean? The outcasts of society. He's probably thinking of the New Testament and Jesus's sort of predilection for persons who are at the margins of society, cripples and the blind, and lepers, and even prostitutes, and even tax collectors who were doing well because they used to fleece the people they taxed, but they were wicked. And Jesus, he came to save a sinner, they say, right? And so he was concerned for them too. Anyway, let's get back to this. Power is bad, it's evil, and weakness is good. And then wealth is evil. You can find that in the Bible, actually, right? This idea that, if they don't call it evil, they say that being wealthy is not intrinsically evil. It serves as a disadvantage for getting into heaven, because if you have a lot of money, you think you're special, because you have the money, and either you earned it and you think you're special because you earned it, or you received it. You have all sorts of prerogatives and social status on account of it. People are always deferring to you, so how can you not think that you're special if people are continuously deferring to you? But that fosters pride, and that makes you think you're the equal of God, or you can give him orders, and then getting into heaven's tougher, right? All right, getting a camel through the eye of a needle is easier, right? Proverbially. So there's wealth, therefore poverty is good. Okay, so you see where Nietzsche's going with this. So you guys think about that. So he calls this the reactive type. So the morality of the active type he calls master morality, and that of the reactive type he calls slave morality. So there are basically two moralities, or two moral systems, if you like, that emerge spontaneously in virtue of nature itself, which is will to power. And there is active will to power, and there's reactive will to power. Active will to power organizes itself in the form of a master morality, and reactive will to power organizes itself in the form of a slave morality. Okay, so you see where's theory, how his theory takes shape. This is all about the origin. Now he does, you guys have picked up, right, in your reading and so far, that Nietzsche will prefer the master morality, okay? So for Nietzsche, modern morality is the last, so he was living in the 19th century. So his modern morality, now he's thinking of, 19th century Germany, decidedly, I mean, it's run by Kaiser Wilhelm towards the end of the 19th century, but it's really run by Otto von Bismarck, who established a kind of conservative welfare state, setting up a pension system and so on and so forth. Nietzsche despised that. He looked upon that as, basically the weak banding together to protect themselves from the strong, and Nietzsche is never for that. Okay, so for Nietzsche, modern morality is the last decadent and disappearing stage of a society determined throughout by slave morality. And he'll link that to Christianity. We'll get to that. It is society based on a reactive will to power, and even in a peculiar form of hatred, a hatred of the master. So this is his critique of basically the modern world, okay, as itself a kind of secularization of the Christian concern for those who are powerless. All right, so it's been part of our tradition to hold that a concern for people who are powerless and weak is a good thing, right? So we want to protect them. And so we can set up soup kitchens and orphanages and homeless shelters and things of that sort. And even atheists in our society, who tend to be on the left, though there are right-wing atheists too, even atheists in our society have a concern for protecting the marginalized. This is basically, they got this from Christianity, guys. So they're concerned with protecting homosexuals and the transgender and so on and so forth, right? And races that have been trod upon, and sometimes people get kind of upset when you put all those people in the same category, right? Says, well, okay, I'm not going to get into too much controversy here. You see what I'm saying, okay? So Nietzsche criticizes all this concern with persons who are either weak or have been victims of injustice or trod upon, and so on and so forth, okay? He's not a big fan of that. So, and don't pin this stuff on me. I'm just telling you what Nietzsche says. So this hatred of masters was first expressed in a particularly cunning way, let's go back to antiquity now, by the priests, those among the passive type, who contrive indirect control of the masters by affirming an expertise in all matters of purity, holiness, and prophecy. So the priestly, they're natural priests, and they belong to the reactive type, but they do have a will to power, and they're very cunning. So you can look into the category of the reactive type. You can divide that into two. They're the reactive type who just don't have the wherewithal in order to figure out through some cunning indirect way of overcoming the masters. But then there's this other subspecies of the reactive, and they work it out. You follow me? They figure it out. They figure out how to get the upper hand on the masters, to set themselves over the masters, and they come up with their own marketing campaign, right? And they sell the masters on the ideals of purity and holiness, and then they, by chance, make a couple of true prophecies, and the masters believe it. The masters see that the prophecies turned out to be true, and they think to themselves, we'd better we better listen to these people. Okay. All right. So now in Nietzsche's vocabulary, the Jews, I prefer to call the people they call Jews in Exodus, those aren't Jews because they're not from Judea yet. Those are Israelites, okay? But the Jews are really the Israelites. As a matter of fact, I'll just change it. I'm not going to go along with inaccuracy. So the Israelites, the nation of priests, they were from Egypt at that point, guys, right? Okay. The nation of priests, look at Exodus 19:6. They brought priestly cunning and hatred of the masters to its perfection, and thus introduced slave morality into the very heart of Western civilization. They began to. At this point, they were a weak, marginal historical phenomenon, right? But this is the beginning of their introducing slave morality into the very heart of Western civilization. By the way, Nietzsche has very often been accused of being an anti-Semite. I don't know if he's strictly an anti-Semite. There may be strains of anti-Semitism. I don't even like that word because it literally means you're being against everyone who speaks a Semitic language, like all Arabs and all Jews and so on, or that you hate all Semitic languages or against all Semitic languages. I mean, so it's kind of an inaccurate term, but it's the one that we have, so I'll just kind of go with it. Just note that it's not accurate. People accuse Nietzsche of being anti-Jewish, right? And his attitude towards the Jews is actually very, very complicated. And you have to look through his corpus and look at all the various things he says about Jews. That itself would be a research project of sorts. But there is a negative evaluation. But he seems to have a negative evaluation to everything except for people like Genghis Khan. Let's just move on. So note that the very question concerning the origin of moral consciousness presupposes skepticism concerning the fixed reality of moral obligations. I'm shifting gears here. So why be concerned about the origin of moral consciousness? Well, typically people who are concerned with the origin of moral consciousness don't believe that there is a transcendent morality, which is anything on all of us. So they want to figure out where it came from. They tend to be atheistic naturalists. Get that, okay? They're not theistic naturalists like the Stoics. For the Stoics, there is a very definite morality, and it's been fixed by the God. All right. For atheistic naturalists, we're basically higher primates. It's more clever than the other primates. And the question then is, well, how did our ability to distinguish and our practice of distinguishing right from wrong and noble from base and just from unjust, how did that enter into human history? Okay, that's what they're concerned with. So anyway, if there are fixed and timeless moral obligations, then there is what philosophers call moral objectivity. That is, moral rules are really binding on you. Okay, and if you disobey one, that becomes a fact of your biography and is to your discredit, and that discredit is an objective reality. Okay, if there are fixed and timeless moral obligations, but if fixed moral obligations are merely apparent, if they don't really exist, then we can infer that moral objectivity does not exist. Now, some persons might try to push back against that, but that's one natural inference to draw. So one substitute for moral objectivity has been relativism. So relativism is almost a kind of watered down moral objectivity, or an attempt at acknowledging atheistic naturalism as true, and then trying to nonetheless squeeze something resembling a moral obligation or set of obligations out of it. So let's talk about it. So moral relativism can be either subjective or cultural. So subjective relativism states that what is right is a function of what you believe to be right, and likewise with wrong. Cultural relativism teaches that what is right and wrong is determined by a culture. Now that could be by the elite in that culture or by the majority in that culture. Okay. So the problem with relativism of whatever sort is that it involves contradictions. The problem of contradiction, guys, keeps coming back. For example, if relativism is true, then one really is bound to do what one thinks one ought to do, right? If it's true, because the idea is that if in subjective relativism, if you think something is right, it is right. And if you think something is a duty, it is a duty for you, not for anyone else. And with respect to cultural relativism, likewise, there would be duties for that culture, but they wouldn't necessarily be the duties for some other culture. Okay, so let's say that subjective relativism is right. You think that there are duties and there are prohibitions. So if one thinks that affirming relativism is bad on this supposition, then one ought not to do so. So if subjective relativism is true, and if you were Pope Benedict or someone like that, and you thought that affirming relativism is bad, you as Pope Benedict would be obligated to deny relativism. But if you also thought that you ought to affirm what is true, and subjective relativism in fact were true, you'd be bound to say that it's true and good. So if you were Pope Benedict and subjective relativism is true, you would be bound to say it is true and it is good, and it is false, that is not true, and it is bad, it is not good. So you have to say it is true, not true, good, and not good. So that all degenerates into mishmash, and that's why subjective relativism is false. You can make a parallel argument for cultural relativism. Just replace some culture for Pope Benedict. So 10.2, Nietzsche goes beyond skepticism about moral objectivity. That's why he went into skepticism. He's not a skeptic. Okay, he wants to go beyond this. He also rejects relativism. Okay, so forget about skepticism about moral objectivity. You can say he is, but he goes beyond that. He also rejects relativism because he sees it's incoherent. Instead, he affirms nihilism. He goes all the way. This is why Nietzsche is so helpful, because he takes these starting points that are common to so many people, like atheistic naturalism. He says, let's think this through all the way to the end. And where you end up is with this, the uninvited guest. Okay, you didn't invite him over, and there he is sitting at your table. You're looking at him. What's his name? Nihilism. All right. You can pronounce it nihilism as well. Since I studied some Latin, I'm not very good at it, but I think nihilism is a perfectly fine way of saying it. The dictionary says you can do that. So the position is that there are no binding norms, moral norms or values, whether absolute or relative. Okay, so yeah, I guess this is a kind of skepticism, but this is a skepticism on steroids. All right. So he distinguishes nihilism into active and passive nihilism. So guess what? So the active nihilism will be the nihilism of the natural masters, and the passive nihilism will be the nihilism of the natural slaves, or the natural peasants, if you like. So passive, I use the word peasant. What's wrong with a peasant? Historically, peasants, they have been rather decent, very hardworking, and in some respects, it's extremely impressive. Okay, so passive nihilism is the affirmation that no received norms and values have any claim on one, so that all that's left is a moral void. So passive nihilists, they tend to succumb to the call of the void, to depression, to a sense of directionlessness, to listlessness, and they can end up being addicted to psychotropics or other recreational narcotics, with which they try to avoid, no pun intended, avoid, to get out of, distract themselves from the doldrums they would otherwise experience. A very sad phenomenon. Okay. Active nihilism also rejects the claim of all received norms and values, but adds that this creates an opportunity for the individual to affirm new values and establish them as a moral foundation for a new epoch. Okay, so your active nihilist, he actually seizes the opportunity and says, great. You know what Hitler said? Hitler said, when everything is chaos in moral discourse, he who has the strongest will prevail. And he thought of himself as possessing that, along with basically himself and then his lieutenants, Himmler, Goering, Goebbels. So they all took up Nietzschean active nihilism. And there's a left-wing version of this too. I mentioned all the right-wing guys here. We'll get to the left-wing stuff too. So they deny that there are eternal truths, but they also affirm that the strongest will determines what the effective truth will be. Well, that's perfectly Nietzschean, right? Okay? Being is willed power. And he who has the strongest will, if they get all the way to the end, he determines what's true for everyone. He draws people into his orbit. Okay? So the people Nietzsche is interested in are, Plato, Jesus, obviously, Mohammed. He would put Napoleon, because Napoleon tried to erase everything they did and replace it with a new sort of secular humanistic epoch, kind of an enlightenment souped up with imperium. So their basic ethical principle is of these active nihilists is do what thou wilt. Do what you will. I said do what thou wilt. I'm taking a line from the occult thinker Aleister Crowley. Their basic metaphysical principle is anything is possible. So they have an ethical principle, do what you will, a metaphysical principle. Well, anything's possible, so do what you will. Nietzsche himself claimed that this is true, that anything is possible. But the truth is hidden from mediocrities, according to him. Okay, so Nietzsche, he wasn't like this comfy, cozy companion through life. He wasn't, a pleasure to be near. He had his opinions, and he called a spade in accordance with his opinions. Okay, I'm not Nietzschean myself. I'm just quoting him and telling you what he would say. How did he put it? I think I'll paraphrase him. It hasn't entered the mind of the ordinary person. It never enters the mind of ordinary people that anything is possible. Okay? By the way, that's the kind of slogan which gets enunciated during major genocides. When the Hutu were killing the Tutsi, one of the lieutenants, the person confronted one of the lieutenants carrying out the murders and said, you can't get away with this. He said, why can't I get away with it? We've already killed 500,000 people. Anything's possible, right? So something like that. So what do we learn from Nietzsche's philosophy? I just showed you what we're standing on a tinderbox here, guys. This is a dangerous philosophy, okay? So first of all, we learn that a thorough materialism does not affirm hedonistic ethics, whether egoism with Hobbes or an altruism with Mill. The natural tendency of the will is not towards pleasure but power. More fully, it is towards the power of the will for the sake of the will. Power of the will for the sake of the will. Okay, so if you're going to be an atheistic naturalist and you're going to insist on it, despite the objections I recorded up further up, this is what you end up with. Otherwise put, the aim and end of the individual for Nietzsche is the self, as affirmed above all other beings. So this reverses the prioritization of theistic supernaturalism, for which it is objectively necessary to surrender the self to God, one's own will, to the divine will. If you don't, right, this is on pain. If you don't do that, it's on pain of willing what is incoherent, namely that the finite, limited, and prone to error, and you and me, ought to wield authority over the infinite, all-knowing, and infallible, right? Which is obvious balderdash. So viewed this way, like there's a common observation, as C.S. Lewis put it most eloquently and clearly. He said, the instant you acknowledge that God exists, right, you're confronted with an ethical choice, which is a kind of almost a metaphysical choice which determines who you're going to be, right? You either subordinate yourself to God, surrender yourself to God, or affirm your own will as independent from God. And C.S. Lewis says the first choice forces itself on you because the second one's incoherent, because you can't make yourself an equal partner to God, and you definitely can't, it makes no sense to issue orders to him, okay? So, but if you don't acknowledge God's existence, or you think you can prove he doesn't exist, you get out of that, that necessity. So I keep saying in this course, you have to go back to metaphysics. Ethics is not an independent discipline. Many of my colleagues treat it as an independent discipline. That's balderdash. It doesn't make any sense. And I think I've shown that by now. Okay, and one day I'll type up a book on this. You can see that the metaphysical positions, they cut channels in thought such that you end up flowing to certain conclusions, and you end up with a range of ethical systems that we've looked at so far. I mean, there are a couple of others, and some people attempt to construct something which is neutral between them. I don't think that works either, but basically they just sidestep the metaphysical questions. That's not going to work either. I can't explain all that right now because I can't say everything at once, and I can't teach you everything. I only have 14 weeks, and we have to make choices. Okay, so here we go. So viewed this way, the entire history of ethics resolves itself into a basic pair of oppositions. So the first opposition is that between theistic supernaturalism versus atheistic naturalism. Okay? All right, so atheistic naturalism, that would be Nietzsche, and theistic supernaturalism, that would be Aristotelio-Thomism, or possibly Kant. All right, so Kant arrives at theistic supernaturalism through the back door, via the primacy of practical reason. Some of you are thinking, well, what about the Stoics? I remember some of you thought that the Stoics could defend themselves against St. Augustine. If you want to rehabilitate the Stoics and put them in here, I'd be very happy to hear that argument. If you remember, I myself was defending them against St. Augustine. I still perceive a basic contradiction in their thesis that one can be happy here in this world, and that nonetheless there is a sufficient reason to take your own life. And those two things don't really jive. So, but I'm willing to listen to defenses. I'm always willing. I'm a philosopher, guys. So that's what I do. I talk to people, go back and forth. But that doesn't mean I live for the sake of discussion. There's no point pursuing the truth without ending up with a definite position, some point or another. Even if it's skepticism. Now, skepticism would be, no positive metaphysical or ethical system is adequately substantiated by any arguments, so I'll just be a skeptic. Okay, you can do that, but you would have to show that your skepticism is true. And if someone brings forward powerful arguments for one or another system, you'd have to show that those arguments don't work, right? So the skepticism itself is very difficult to establish. You don't get that for free. All right, so the second choice we get is the ethics of surrendering the self to God for his sake. So now we're, A has to do with the metaphysics, B has to do with the ethics. The ethics of surrendering the self to God for his sake versus the ethics of the affirmation of self for its sake. That's the basic distinction. All right, there we go. Now, some persons in the discussion boards and journals have suggested that, if you even mention God, that you have to be bringing in revelation in the Bible. Again, I can't repeat this enough. That's not true. It's just not true. We're in a philosophy class now, guys. This is not a theology class. It's not Sunday school. In a philosophy class, we use the power of human reason first to determine whether God exists or not. Second, to determine what attributes we have to ascribe to him. Third, to determine how we then are to understand ourselves in relation to him. Fourth, in relation to the third, to determine what our duties are vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis one another, given that God's will is sovereign. Okay, all that has to do with human reason. So please don't make the mistake of thinking that you're somehow sneaking in the Bible the instant you use the word God. Okay, so note that the ethics of Nietzsche's affirmative nihilism has divided itself historically into left-wing and right-wing varieties. We have to observe this. Because Nietzsche's been very, very, very influential. You can even say the 20th century is, in some respect, Nietzsche's century. Okay, a little bit of an exaggeration. It's also Karl Marx's century. It's also Darwin's century. It's also Freud's. Now, Freud is a clinical application of Nietzscheanism. Freud also thought of himself as an atavar of the Jewish Messiah. Most people think pseudo-Messiah, Shabbatai Zevi, who had a rather lax morality towards the end there. But no matter. So Freud, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche would despise Marx, and Nietzsche, those four are dominant in the 20th century and heading into the 21st. So left-wing Nietzscheans place the emphasis on continuous self-overcoming. Okay, so we keep that. That's the phrase they always use over that. I can't tell you how much has been published on this. Continuous. I even met Catholic priests who call themselves Catholic Nietzscheans. So the first time I heard this, I said, "What are you talking about? Nietzsche's the one who said God is dead. Is an atheistic naturalist. He hates Christianity. What is it? How can you possibly be a Catholic or a Christian Nietzschean?" They said, "Oh, no, because we have devoted ourselves to self-overcoming, a certain kind of fearless pursuit of perfection." Okay, that was already there in the Catholic tradition. I don't think you have to get Nietzsche in there to help do that. And it was always oriented towards virtue and the perfection of sacrificial love, and not thinking about yourself at all, and being willing to suffer all things for God, for neighbor, and that was already there. But they can do that if they like. I don't want to rain on anybody's parade. Now, this continuous self-overcoming in the left-wing version, put the Catholic priest to one side. That's sort of an aberration, really. They pursue this without connection or subordination to the common good, the left-wingers, right? Or to God, or to moral virtue. So left-wing Nietzscheanism ultimately assumes the form of moral experimentation, rebelliousness against the social order, the thrill of transgression, indifferent to how one's behavior affects others. Basically turns into the 60s, guys, okay, and beyond. Its fruits are sexual liberation, the avant-garde, drug culture, rock and roll, and the occult, and popular music and things of that sort. A lot of that has all been co-opted by corporate America, who's turned it into a profit mill. So corporate America takes all this stuff, sexual liberation, the avant-garde not so much, but a bit, even drug culture, rock and roll, because if you have rock and roll, you have drug culture. You had hip hop, pop music, all of it, even the occult, because that's part of rock and roll too, by the way. Look at what's his name? Who was the guy in the Rolling Stones, the lead singer? Mick Jagger. He has a big tattoo of Satan on his chest. All those guys. Led Zeppelin, they practiced the occult. Their concerts were large, open occult rituals in accordance with the magical teaching of Aleister Crowley. This is what it was. The guy David Bowie, he was a big occultist. Even Daryl Hall, of all people, practiced the occult. Even Sting, of all people, from the Police. You remember him? All of them, really. Carole King, you name anybody. Rock and roll is continuous with the occult. It's even an expression of the occult. All right. Elvis Presley. God, I got to keep going on. Elvis Presley had a familiar. He thought he could talk. He was talking to a spirit in the form of a cat. John Lennon was a big practitioner of the occult. It's one after the other. That establishes it. I can go on forever. I literally can keep going. I'm going to stop. So right-wing Nietzscheans assert the nobility of power as concentrated in one or another racial group that ought to dominate all others up to the point of exterminating some of them. So you're thinking Nazis, but also think Hutu, okay? They too embrace a certain controlled form of sexual liberation and the occult. The Nazis particularly, they were occultist guys. So they wanted to resuscitate the old Norse religion and come into contact with the Norse gods and channel the energy of the Norse gods through their rituals. That's the occult. So the ultimate fruits of right-wing Nietzscheanism, by the way, this other stuff up here, the left-wing Nietzschean fruits, I mean, that begins well prior to the 60s, but it explodes in the 60s. The fruits of right-wing Nietzscheanism are deportations, concentration camps, and mass liquidations, okay? And hunting around online, you find some people putting forward arguments that the people who are irritated about, understandably, the destruction of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, persons putting forward the argument the Holocaust never happened, or maybe only like 250,000 people were killed. That appears to be just balderdashing. I just read a whole book on the Holocaust and the arguments they put forward. How to put this? They're very selective and they were arranged in just the right way to make it look plausible. But all their central points could get destroyed by the actual facts. Like, for example, they say, when you go to Auschwitz, you can't find any gas chambers. There's no record there was a gas chamber. Actually, Himmler ordered on November 25th of 1944, he ordered every camp to blow up their gas chambers. Okay, that's what happened there. The other argument is all the gas chambers appear magically in Poland, where the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union took over, and so in fact, this report there were gas chambers there is just Soviet anti-Nazi propaganda. The Nazis didn't want the gas chambers anywhere near the German people themselves, right? They wanted to keep that hidden and off by the side and hidden and out of sight, right? And so on and so forth. It just goes on. So criticisms of Nietzsche. Let's turn to that. We always turn to criticisms. Criticisms of Nietzsche have not been lacking. First, we saw that his thorough adherence to time, temporality, against the atemporal, bore the implication that nothing is fixed, not even his own principle of will to power. At best, he could get an atheistic supernaturalism, which he doesn't want. This removes the foundation of his whole system. Now, if you want to become an atheistic supernaturalist and defend that, work that out, I guess that's a logical alternative, but I think that'll be tough also. I mean, where'd that principle of contradiction come from? It's just there, kind of floating out there in the supernatural realm. You have to give an account of those abstract structures which are in the realm that transcends nature. And I think sooner or later, I'm not going to do that now for you. You think that through, you end up with God. Okay. So second, he offers us the unintended benefit of showing that atheistic naturalism is necessarily incoherent, so I argue, okay? Third, if the philosophy of the will to power is false, then his distinction between active and passive psychological types, however illuminating, cannot be exhaustive. Therefore, we should reconsider the classical theory of the temperaments. That third point is pretty important. So his own division doesn't seem to be, it can't be correct because his basic quasi-metaphysics is false. And so I would say we have to look at the classic theory of the temperaments that accounts more fully for these different psychological types. And here is a YouTube video where he talks about that. Now, it looks like I'm over time now. So if you want to stop, you can stop, okay? But this next little bit here is extremely important. So I hope you'll stick with me, okay? I'll just give this to you as a bonus. Fourth, we have already seen that both left-wing and right-wing Nietzscheanism are destructive of life. Okay, so either through producing a population of persons who are drugged out and promiscuous and antisocial, or through literally liquidating millions of people. Fifth, Max Scheler offers perhaps the most searching and penetrating critique of Nietzsche. He observes that Nietzsche expresses a pronounced weakness before weakness itself. You probably recall those passages. The vehement language Nietzsche employs to express his loathing for and aversion to the weak, in fact, betrays his own lack of strength and that of all those who sympathize with them, okay, including the Nazis. And there's a left-wing version of this too. You know, persons who practice a certain kind of sexual probity or chastity, they're just too weak. We can, leave them behind and hold them in contempt. So true strength is that superabundance. True strength is that superabundance which stoops to help the weak, the deformed, the victims, the despised, so as to raise them up to his own superabundant life. That's Scheler's point. Okay. Otherwise put, true strength takes the form of sacrificial love. Now we're back to that idea. Look at that. So we have encountered such love in Aristotelian-Thomism, and several of you in your journals and discussion board contributions have argued that Kant is bound to recognize sacrificial love. This again would return us to a choice between the two, albeit perhaps with a Stoic ingredient in each, either Aristotelian Thomism or Kant. That seems to be where the course is headed. It's one or the other, right? So I will suggest, however, that what we actually encounter in Kant is the possibility not of sacrificial love, but of sacrificial duty. It's a different idea. That one may perform an act of supreme sacrifice, not motivated by goodwill for the persons benefited, even if you have a goodwill in the sense of doing your duty for the sake of duty, but simply by the consciousness that it is one's duty to act in this way. That's Kantian. He tends to look down his nose at love, guys. This is exemplified by the fireman who loses his life to save others, the soldier who dies for his country, the captain who goes down with his ship so that more of his passengers and crew members can escape, or the teacher who stands in front of his students to protect them from an active shooter. But is there not something grim in excluding love, the love of human beings, from what is morally praiseworthy in such actions? So let's say somebody acts from duty and he does one of those things. It's admirable, right? Now, what if a second person does the exact same type of action but from duty and love? Who's more admirable? Okay. So granted that one should do one's moral duty, is it not more praiseworthy to do it from the motive of love? Isn't virtue, by definition, preferable to self-control? And the answer to that, I think, is obviously yes, right? So this observation prompts a reflection on a certain specimen and product of Western civilization that in fact combines in one person the attributes that Nietzsche sets in opposition to one another. Okay, so Nietzsche puts like humility and gentleness on one side, and then impetuosity and pride on the other. Okay, but it is one and the same individual who may exhibit the most extreme humility and gentleness, passive attributes, but also a kind of firmness, tireless energy, initiative, and even occasional impetuosity, the attributes of the active type. So perhaps the best sort of person combines these two. And we didn't get into those chapters in Plato's Republic, but he describes that even there in pagan antiquity. So the praise of humility and gentleness is not characteristic of the Romans, Greeks, or barbarians. So it's not the Romans, it's not the Greeks, it's not the European barbarians, and I don't think any other place. Okay, okay. The followers of Confucius. Okay, we can't build everything in this course, but you might say the followers of Confucius would also at least praise a certain gentleness and a certain humility. Okay, but within the Western tradition, not the Romans, not the Greeks, not the barbarians, we inherit the praise of humility and gentleness from the ancient Israelites and from Christianity. So the unification of humility and firmness and energy, humility and firmness and energy is perhaps best known to us from literature. Right? It's easier to see this because you can read an entire novel about somebody who depicts these or exemplifies these virtues and get into how the author thinks about how these things are unified. So no figure in the English language literature is gentler or more humble than Cordelia from King Lear, if you don't know. Okay, and yet she dies exercising the role of warrior queen, right? The figure of Ivanhoe is the model of gentleness, self-sacrifice, and tireless energy. In a word, opposite qualities are fused in him in the ideal of chivalry. Okay, so as soon as I say chivalry, you're saying, okay, so you're talking about a fantasy, some kind of ideal that's never been realized in any person. There are a bunch of guys running around in armor, and they just did that in order to slug people and take their stuff and whatnot. Well, no, I mean, it's a little bit cynical. Some of them did that, but there was definitely a culture of chivalry. I mean, that's just an historical fact. And there was at least the active project of blending all of these qualities in one person. Okay, looking to the real world, let's look at the first generation of Jesuits, because in medieval Europe, heading into the Renaissance, the Jesuits are Renaissance figures. That's basically Catholic Europe at that point, right? So these Jesuits exhibited, you got to read about these guys, a nearly superhuman capacity to combine sacrifice and mercy with a seemingly boundless energy for missionary work. I mean, read about the life of Saint Francis Xavier or Father Vieira. I don't think they've sainted him, but look, this is the fellow who more or less converted Brazil. I have no idea how they did it. I doubt that I could do that. I mean, building churches, orphanages, and publishing 80 volumes of theology. I don't know how a person does that. Okay, so a long list of laity exemplify the combination of love, joy, peace with energy, fortitude, and audacity. One need merely mention Pius Louis IX, King Philip II, Blessed Emperor Karl. Okay, and for all these persons I mentioned, there will be detractors, like Protestant Christians hate the Jesuits, and there probably were a few corrupt Jesuits in there, maybe a few corrupt ones right now. And some people will attack these figures. So I'm not going to be able to put forward any figure who's beyond controversy. Maybe, I mean, even if I say Mother Teresa, you say, oh, that's someone who got propped up because the Catholic Church is interested in forcing, their saints on us. I mean, someone could say that. Martin Luther King. Someone will say, oh, he plagiarized his dissertation. That's true, right? So you can attack anyone. Gandhi. Gandhi, he took the one quip is it took the incomes of two Maharishis in India to sustain him in poverty. And he slept in a bed, filled with beautiful women. And that was part of his spiritual exercise. He would surround himself with these beautiful young women, and supposedly not touch any of them, right? So that was supposed to make him more perfect. Anyway, so otherwise put, there was a higher plane of moral perfection that Nietzsche seems to have been either oblivious to, even actively hostile to, because he would say here that we're forcing opposites together that don't blend. Well, that's really an open question, guys. Historically, they seem to have blended. So this reality that I refer to here corresponds not with energetic egotism, but with the fullest and most vital realization of sacrificial love. More contemporary cases. How about Frederick Douglass? Okay, this is a tireless person. In my opinion, the best stylist in American letters. For me, he's the best wielder of the English tongue, and that's saying something because we've had some pretty good people. Herman Melville, certainly. Maybe Melville's his equal, but I'll take Douglas for he's more consistent. And at some point, Henry James. I'll still take Douglas. So, or how about someone like Doris Day? Some of you are saying, well, how about a woman? Okay. Well, how about Mother Teresa? How about her? There's a tireless and energetic sacrificial love. So I just where I stand, it just seems that Nietzsche is not really in contact, adequately in contact with reality, and no surprise, his basic metaphysics, you can call it that, or basic cosmology, is incoherent. All right, so we may reformulate the basic opposition to Western ethics in the form of a sequence of choices to be laid before each individual. A, to affirm the existence of God or to deny it. Okay, you either affirm or deny it, and please do so on the basis of rational arguments. Or if you have a direct relationship with God and you know that he exists because you have that relationship, then you don't have to learn the arguments because you have that relationship. Other persons would say, how do you know you have it? I guess we have a certainty, you have a certainty, and that's the end of it. It might help to learn them anyway, learn proofs for the existence of God anyway, so you can just talk about it with people. B, here's one option: to surrender. How do I end up with surrendering? To surrender one's will to God for his sake versus to assert one's own will for the sake of the self. Okay? C is actually a third option here. That's to realize ever more perfectly the life of sacrificial love. I'm sorry. There's a third opposition which corresponds to the first two. C, to realize ever more perfectly the life of sacrificial love versus to realize ever more fully the self and its power over others. Now we can put the Kantian alternative here, to realize ever more perfectly the life of duty up to the point of sacrificial duty versus to realize ever more fully the self and its power over others. The difficulty with Kant is that he wants to acknowledge that there's an infinite God. And this God we saw has to be infinite, while not surrendering one's will to God, being, as it were, morally self-reliant, okay, and making God effectively one's slave. And that's a contradiction. I mean, I'll just say in my own words that that's a contradiction. You want to save Kant, you're welcome to try. So now, these three choices one has to make, okay? These produce three kinds of life. So the first life is to affirm God's existence. Number one, that's your metaphysics, right? To surrender one's will to him, okay? That's an act of self-determination, okay? And then to embody sacrificial love. So you live it out. So call this the God-devoted life. And you can abbreviate this with affirm, surrender, and embody. There's a second possibility, and that is to deny God's existence, assert one's own will, and increase in power. And that is what I would call the anthropomorphic egotistical life. And so you can capture that with three verbs: deny, assert, and increase. All right, then there's a third one, which is a rather peculiar looking one. It's a logical possibility, so I put it down. There's to affirm God's existence, but nonetheless to assert one's own will over his existence, and thus to increase in power. I would call this the diabolical life. This is where you acknowledge that God exists, right? You acknowledge he exists, but you say, better to rule in hell. I'm going to oppose him. So this would correspond to the verbs affirm, reject, and increase. Those are the logical alternatives. Hope you don't choose number three. That one looks pretty dangerous. The three choices, God-devoted, anthropomorphic egotism, and diabolism, are as far as philosophy can take us. To go further, one must add premises specific to those religions that worship the one true God. It is a basic historical fact that the God-devoted life is basically divided on the question of Jesus Christ. So Christians affirm that Christ is God. Jews deny that Christ is God, and actually, he's a criminal. Okay. Muslims say Christ is not God, but he is a very good man and a prophet, and he'll preside in judgment over all souls at the end of time. All right. So let's move on. So Nietzsche's philosophy of will to power, in fact, allows for a division within anthropomorphic egotism. This is the division between the particular egotism of the isolated self and the collective egotism of the mass, defined in accordance with one or another criterion, that of race or class. What I'll do is I'll just make this available to you. I go on here about the endless acquisition of money and power, and how we are entering into a technocratic totalitarian regime, as a matter of fact, based upon racial eugenics. It was not very cheery. Sorry about that, but I think that's where we're headed. Okay, and I'm not going to get into that now. So I'm way over time. I'm going to stop, and hope that helped you, and your wheels are turning. So keep in touch, and look forward to hearing what you have to say about this. Be well.